On September 2nd, 1609, an English explorer hired by the Dutch to find a faster route to the riches of the Orient steered his 80-ton ship off the surging currents of the North Atlantic and into an immense, sheltered bay. Sailing to the mouth of the mile-wide river that flowed into it from the north, he pushed 100 miles upstream, hoping it led to China. It didn't. But though he had failed to find the Northwest Passage, Henry Hudson had stumbled upon something even better. One of the biggest and best natural harbors in the world. A safe haven, one fellow explorer said, wherein 1,000 ships may ride in safety. Of all the early explorers, Hudson was the first to sense the immense potential of the remote and lonely harbor. Yet even he could never have foreseen the tremendous human forces it would one day unleash, nor that the great city that would rise there would be dedicated to a crucial experiment, one that would grow ever more urgent with each passing year. The exhilarating, often harrowing experiment to see whether all the peoples of the world could live together in a single place.
New York City was founded by the Dutch. The Dutch didn't give a damn about anything except making money. And the more money you made, the closer you were to God. And they would build some churches to thank him for his generously setting things up for them.
Unlike Boston or Philadelphia or many other places in the United States, New York was not founded by visionaries anxious to create a new place to practice their own version of religious freedom. The Dutch came to New York City and established a trading post there to make a buck or to make a guilder. And that acquisitiveness, that materialism, that search for the success has dominated New York and characterized New York ever since the white person first set foot on this land.
New York is the finest harbor in the Atlantic Ocean. You start there. And just as harbor, but it's so much more, it's an entrance into North America.
New York cannot be understood aside from its geography. Indeed, no city could. But New York more so than almost any city in the world, because here you have what's really a natural location for a great city. It's probably one of the 3 greatest harbors in the world. And then what's key is at the very heart of New York is an island, Manhattan. So the United States in the early 17th century were on the island of Manhattan because it was a natural location for a great city.
As soon as they saw the sails of Hudson's ship, the local inhabitants, who called themselves the Lenape, rowed out to meet them, trying to keep pace with the strange-looking vessel as it made its way across the bay. 28 canoes, full of men, women, and children, one of Hudson's officers reported, seeming very glad of our coming. 15 years later, in the spring of 1624, the first boatload of colonists arrived to establish a permanent presence in the harbor, spurred on by Hudson's glowing reports of a fur-trading paradise, and eager to beat out their arch-rivals, the English, to the spoils of the North American continent. It was a business proposition from the very start. From one end to the other, the new colony was owned and operated by a giant corporation called the Dutch West India Company, the Atlantic wing of a vast trading empire that stretched round the world.
The Dutch East India Company, from which the Dutch West India Company we would call today kind of a subsidiary corporation, was one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the history of the world. For 200 years, it returned average annual profit in excess of 10%. So when we talk about the Dutch East India Company, we're not talking about some cutesy little company. We're talking about a company that was more successful and more powerful than IBM in our own time. And they anchored their North American operations on the place they call New Amsterdam.
Most of the first Dutch colonists were not in fact Dutch, but French-speaking Belgian Huguenots. 110 men, women, and children in all, in 30 different families, cast-offs hoping to make a go of it in the New World. They quickly settled on the slender island at the head of the bay, which they called Mannahatta, after an old Indian word, thought by some to mean Island of Hills, and by others, place of general inebriation. At the southernmost tip, they cleared land and built simple bark cabins, a crude counting house, and a stone and earth fort. Then widened the old Indian trail that ran north from the makeshift village and named it Heerstraat, or Breedaway. It would become Broadway. Other settlements soon sprang up around the harbor, including the village of Breukelen, named for a town back in Holland, and up along the East River, a sprawling plantation owned by a Danish farmer named Jonas Bronk. It was soon known simply as the Bronx. In 1626, just 2 years after the colony was founded, a ship carrying the first 11 African slaves arrived from Angola. They were quickly put to work building the fort and clearing land for white farmers. That same year, the Director General, Peter Minuit, called together the leaders of all the local tribes and made them a fateful offer. They have bought the island Manhattas from the wild men, the company accountant later reported, for the value of 60 guilders. The Dutch had, in fact, paid much more than the $24 of legend, but still less than $600 for all 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate. The Indians, who had lived on the island since the end of the Ice Age, thought the arrangement temporary.
What's at the beginning of the city is at the end of the city, it's a real estate deal. And if there's ever a kind of motif that runs through the history of the city, it's that. It's the real estate deal at the beginning of the very existence of the city.
New York was founded for no other reason than to make a buck. The Puritans came to New England in order to worship God as they saw fit. The Catholics came to Maryland, the Quakers to Pennsylvania. The Dutch came to Manhattan to get beaver skins. And so devoted were they to making a profit that they didn't get around to even building a church for 17 years. And ever since, however big the city has gotten, somewhere deep in its soul, it is always New Amsterdam, where modern capitalism was invented.
But there were problems from the start. Though thick bales of beaver, otter, muskrat, and mink were soon being shipped back to Holland 4 times a year, the remote and lonely colony, 4,000 miles from the mother country, struggled to take hold.
People in Holland are, in fact, not terribly interested in coming here. The promoters sent back these tracts about the glories of this place. But, you know, the fact of the matter was that from a Dutch perspective, if you were in Amsterdam and you wanted to make your fortune out in the colonies, you went to the Spice Islands, you went to Brazil, you got into the African slave trade. Beavers was a distinctly second-rate operation. It was for second-rank merchants.
In the winter of 1643, the colony's troubles deepened when an incompetent director named Willem Kieft tried to tax the local Indians, then launched a brutal year-long war against them when they resisted. In February, a platoon of Dutch soldiers fell on 2 unsuspecting Lenape villages along the East River, butchered 80 men, women, and children in their sleep, then marched back to Fort Amsterdam with their heads on pikes. Before the year was out, hundreds of Native Americans and dozens of Dutch settlers had died in what was called the Year of the Blood. Less than 2 decades after being founded, the fledgling colony had begun to fall apart. Its population dwindling, drunkenness on the rise, and morale at an all-time low.
The most interesting thing about the Dutch period in New York to me is how much it set the pattern for behavior in New York. I forget what the exact ratio is, but there was an absurd ratio of citizens to taverns. It was virtually that every 20 guys had their own tavern. And it remains a ratio that's probably pretty close to the way the city has remained throughout its history.
It's like Dodge City. I mean, every other building is a bar, it's a mud hole, the sinkhole, the fort is falling down, pigs are rooting in the foundations. We need to shake this place up. And what they do is they, like a global corporation that they were, you can sort of think of the West India Company as sort of like Exxon with guns, I mean, with its own naval fleet. They transferred a branch manager from Curacao up to New York and said, we want you to whip this place into shape. And he did.
In the spring of 1647, New Amsterdam got a new director general, a 37-year-old ex-soldier and minister's son, who had lost his right leg to a cannonball during a naval battle in the West Indies. Iron-willed, short-tempered, and puritanical, Peter Stuyvesant had strict orders to clean the place up and make it pay. I shall govern you as a father his children, he told the stubborn and unruly citizens of New Amsterdam. And it was soon apparent he meant every word he said. Within weeks of his arrival, he had banned drinking on Sundays, outlawed knife fighting in public, and imposed stiff fines for missing church, speeding on Broadway, and fornicating with the Indians. It was the beginning of a long and stormy relationship between the Director General and his colonists. But though they bitterly resented Stuyvesant's high-handed style of rule, New Amsterdam began to take hold.
In an incredibly short space of time, he has slaves lay out the road up to Harlem, gets a wall built, has streets built, has the port fixed up, builds himself an extremely nice house, takes a large chunk of the slave population for himself, but in fact, makes this place into a functioning operation. The population increases. He establishes a base, an economic base, which is slaving. This is going to be a slave entrepot, and they're going to run slaves into here and then down to the Caribbean.
By 1653, in less than 5 years, Stuyvesant had managed to transform the disorderly backwater into a bustling town, with its own piers, canals, windmills, and schools, 300 row houses, a population of 3,000, and a 2,340-foot wall, stretching all the way from the East River to the Hudson, built to keep out hostile Indians and the English.
So many things about New York that we think of as being unusual or distinctive in the 20th century really have their origins hundreds of years in the past. One thinks of congestion. Every American, every person in the world really knows about New York and its unusual vertical shape and the crowded streets. But again, this goes back to the 17th century, really, when the little Dutch village was crowded down in lower Manhattan and all the houses were flush up against each other. Or the heterogeneity of the population already in the 1640s. There were 18 different languages being spoken on the streets.
Though it offended Stuyvesant's keen sense of order, to ease the chronic labor shortage, he reluctantly agreed to let in almost anyone willing to work. Census takers soon reported hearing a chorus of languages on the streets of New Amsterdam, including French, English, German, Spanish, Polish, and Portuguese. By 1654, the Dutch had become a minority in their own colony, and Stuyvesant himself feared that New Amsterdam would soon become too diverse to rule.
If nothing is done to stop it, I fear this colony will soon become a babel of confusion. We have here Papists, Mennonites, and Lutherans among the Dutch. Also many Puritans or independents, and many atheists who conceal themselves under the name of Christians. It would create a still greater confusion if the obstinate and immovable Jews came to settle here.
But they soon did. In 1654, 23 Sephardic Jews sailed into the harbor, seeking refuge from the Spanish Inquisition in Brazil. Stuyvesant immediately petitioned the board of directors of the Dutch West India Company to have them turned away, insisting, he said, that none of the Jewish nation be permitted to infest New Netherland. To his astonishment, the petition was overturned. Chiding him for his bigotry, the directors reminded Stuyvesant that he was running a business colony, not a religious establishment, and that for the sake of that business, no one should be turned away.
The consciences of men ought to be free and unshackled, so long as they continue moderate, peaceable, inoffensive, and not hostile to government. Such have been the maxims of toleration by which this city has been governed. And the result has been that the oppressed and persecuted from every country have found among us an asylum from distress. Follow in the same steps, and you shall be blessed.
On September 12, 1654, the first Rosh Hashanah service in North America was held in private in New Amsterdam. It was the beginning of Congregation Shearith Israel, the oldest existing Jewish congregation in the New World. It was also the beginning of the separation of church and state in America. In the centuries to come, the city's greatest challenges and greatest strengths would always come from its astonishing diversity.